And there are the democratic rituals which allow people to believe that they have control over government, that people get the government they deserve, and if we have a lousy government, it's our own fault. And therefore, it's necessary to say something briefly about the way in which the notion of democracy itself has been degraded from control over your conditions of life to the right to vote. Now, in the beginning, the Constitution of the United States and a number of other countries was set up in such a way as to permit voting for public office, and then built in several controls to prevent that from being exercised too freely. The restriction was first who was allowed to vote, and in the beginning it meant white propertied males. Secondly, it led to the creation of political parties. These are straight of people who are either themselves the owning class or else their attorneys and their employees. And they guarantee that no matter who is in office, the decisions that are made favor the concerns of the owning class. And in that sense, the constitutions have been very successful. No matter how bitter the electoral campaigns, no matter how rapidly or slowly the turnover of office holders, the social makeup of the ruling groups remains pretty much the same. On the one hand, it's those elected to office because they come through the political parties. On the other hand, the permanent civil service who are screened and selected in order to carry out the responsibilities assigned to them by the owners. The trouble is that once you set up democratic rules, you can't advertise it as saying, look at us, we have a great government for keeping the rich in power. So the rhetoric was one of everybody having choice, equality, we have free elections, free press, free choice. If we don't like what government is doing, we can throw them out, and so on. Now, the trouble with that rhetoric is that people who hear it may take it seriously. And so the history of democratic societies has been the proposing of a rhetoric of ideal democracy, the mechanisms for restricting it, and the demands of people for extending it. So if the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, what about black? And the founders were really very embarrassed by slavery. And what they said was that on the one hand, slavery is bad, on the other hand, it's necessary. And they tried to rationalize this in a number of ways. Then the women began to say, well, we can read politics, we can write, we can publish, why can't we vote? What about the property requirement? In a democracy, all men are created equal, everybody should have the right to vote. And so what happens is that the history has been one of increasing demands to extend democracy to more people and the invention of more ingenious mechanisms for restricting the exercise of that democracy. Mark Twain described it by saying that the American people have had three blessings: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the prudence to exercise neither of the two. Now, in the constraints on the exercise of freedom operate through a number of filters. One is the typical career of somebody in politics, where you start out running for the school board or the water board, and generally the local authority is controlled by the real estate people. At one time it was the tavern owners, then it became the realtors, then the realtors through the bankers. So local politics screens people to be suitable. Sometimes there's an upsurge from below. Communities organize, they elect some of their own representatives, and you find yourself in a city council. And then you face the dilemma: am I always going to be there to get up and when my turn is in order to denounce the crookery or I'm going to do something practical. And that means compromise. So compromise has been elevated to one of the great virtues of democracy. And when they talk about bipartisanship, what it usually means is that instead of serving the interest of a particular company, you serve the interests of the ruling group as a whole. And they talk about it as national interest. So my sense is whenever they talk about bipartisanship, I dust off my picket signs. I know there's going to be a sellout. And so at one time we were raising the issue, the slogan, cross the tracks, not the aisle. Now, but sometimes it happens that somebody is elected and is more independent than the rulers would like. There are various ways of making that person ineffective. There are the lures, the flattery of being in office. There are the visits of the lobbyists. There's the sense of horse trading. Okay, you would block the construction of that chemical plant, but in that case, why don't you vote for free trade with Mexico? If somebody violates these rules, the unspoken rules of the game, they may not be renominated. And finally, the last resort is assassination. A successful, well-running capitalist country resorts to assassination very rarely. In an incipient one where they're just developing the structures of corruption, assassination is quite frequent. In the Mexican elections last time, something like 100 candidates were assassinated. Legislators are regularly murdered, union organizers, and so on. But assassination and violence is regarded by the more comfortable capitalist regimes as a sign of uncouthness. They haven't really learned to govern yet.
I was going to ask, in regards to assassination, I would agree with the generalization that that's how it's viewed, and yet I don't know how to make sense of the fact that the United States consistently deploys assassination as an attempt to disrupt, at least in Latin American politics, the revolutions in Cuba, Chile. I mean, even if you want to take it beyond just the act of assassination, the training of armies which are deployed against their own citizens in Latin American countries. It seems to me that while on the one side maintaining that that is uncouth, we're above that, we understand democracy, yet while at the same time delving the other hand into mechanisms of very, very forceful manipulation of the democratic process.
Yes.
It leaves me ambivalent.
Yes, so I should correct what I said. That for their own country, they consider assassination a last resort and an evidence of failure. It's a partial failure of the control mechanism. The other control mechanisms are through education and propaganda. The control of the media. And this control is exercised through a wide latitude of choice. Until relatively recently, there was diversity of opinion in the press, but always within boundaries. And you can understand those boundaries better when you compare the range of news and opinion in the U.S. press to that of even European press. Like Le Monde Diplomatique, La Jornada in Mexico, Página 12 in Argentina, Al Jazeera, even BBC and CBC, Canadian broadcast, will allow other subject matter to be discussed that's screened out of the American media. So the media and education are vehicles for maintaining control. Antonio Gramsci was the one who first developed a systematic study of this phenomenon. What he said is that most of the time, most ruling classes do not rule by force.